The fluorescent lights of Mercy General's ICU hum at 2:02 a.m., a sound like insects trapped in glass, and Megan O'Brien moves through the white-walled corridor with the kind of invisibility that takes 2 years to perfect. Her sneakers are silent on linoleum that smells of antiseptic and something else, the copper undertone of old blood that never quite washes away. She checks vitals on 3 patients in Bay 4, her hand steady as a surgical laser, her voice soft enough that the residents at the nursing station don't look up when she passes. Nobody looks up. This is how she survives. The limp in her right leg is barely visible if you're not trained to notice it. Old shrapnel, 3/4 of an inch from her femoral artery, lodged where surgery would cause more damage than leaving it. She carries it the way she carries everything else, without complaint, without explanation, without drawing attention. Her scrubs are navy blue, forgettable. Her badge photo shows her looking at the camera like she'd rather be anywhere else. The name on the badge reads M. O'Brien, RN. Nobody asks what the M stands for. The night shift at Mercy General is the province of ghosts and the invisible. The attending physicians do their rounds at 6 a.m., when the light changes and the hospital transforms into something resembling a real place. Until then, the night nurses run everything, they manage the crises, they anticipate the collapses, they hold the dying when there's no one else to do it. But they're ghosts. They are forgettable. This is what Megan chose. 2 years ago, she walked away from 17 combat deployments and a Navy Cross locked in a safety deposit box in Chapel Hill. 2 years ago, she told her 17-year-old son that she processed insurance claims in a windowless office across town. 2 years ago, every helicopter sound made her feel incoming fire, and the only way to stop flinching was to disappear into a place where she could use her hands to save people without having to explain why she knew so much about hemorrhage control and airway management under pressure. Mercy General asked no questions when she applied. Her nursing credentials were solid, 3 years of active duty field medicine, supplemented by an accelerated RN program at a community college that Sterling would later use to dismiss her as beneath the hospital standards. Nobody asked about the gap in her employment. Nobody asked about her previous address being a military base in Kandahar. She became M. O'Brien, night nurse, forgettable and invisible, exactly as intended. At 2:51 a.m., the ER intercom crackles like a throat being cleared. Code trauma. Gunshot wounds, multiple. ETA for minutes. Megan is checking a patient central line in Bay 2 when she hears it, and her body goes still for one heartbeat, not from fear, but from recognition. The kind of alert that means real work. The kind that wakes up the part of her that never actually sleeps. She finishes documenting the line placement. Notes the reading on the cardiac monitor. Moves to Bay 1 and begins the setup process with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has done this in sandstorms and firefight noise. Trauma Bay prep means pulling the level 1 rapid infuser down from its overhead mount, checking the pressure gauge on the oxygen tank, laying out the instrument trays with the kind of precision that makes the difference between a patient who bleeds out and one who lives to see morning. The residents are doing the same work, but they move like learners. They move like people who have read about trauma in textbooks. Megan moves like someone who has held pressure on a femoral artery while helicopters landed in wind strong enough to knock you sideways, who knows that arterial spray looks different in person than in clinical photographs, who understands that the difference between confusion and clarity under pressure is the difference between someone walking out of the hospital and someone not walking out at all. Dr. Sterling arrives at 2:54 a.m., 5 minutes before the patient, and he moves through the ICU the way a predator moves through territory, with the absolute certainty that everything here exists for his use and approval. He is 53 years old, attended Johns Hopkins for medical school, has a wife in a house worth $2.4 million, and has never once in his career been told that he is wrong by anyone in a position to make it matter. He sees the night nurse setting up the trauma bay, and what he sees is a forgettable woman with community college credentials doing competent but unremarkable work. What he does not see is the way her hands move, the rhythm of someone who has performed a pericardiocentesis while lying in a ditch with incoming fire, who knows the feel of a needle sliding through the pericardial membrane the way a musician knows the fingerboard of an instrument. What he does not see is the controlled breathing pattern, in through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 6, the pattern that keeps your heart rate down when everything around you is chaos. What he does not see is that the quiet night nurse has scars on her forearms that disappear under her sleeves when she pulls them down, that she carries a small silver coin in her scrub pocket that nobody has ever asked about, that she has looked death in the face so many times that the sight of blood no longer registers as crisis, it registers as information. The ambulance sirens grow louder at 2:58 a.m., a sound like something wounded, and then the ER doors burst open with a kind of controlled chaos that only happens when paramedics know exactly what they're transporting. Colonel James Hartley is wheeled in on a stretcher, his uniform cut away, his chest open to the fluorescent lights, and there are 3 entry wounds, one in the right upper abdomen, one in the left shoulder, one in the right thigh. Remedy. The word is not spoken, but it's written in the pattern of the wounds. The paramedic is calling vitals in a steady voice, BP 88/52 and dropping, heart rate 138, respiratory rate 24, O2 sat 91 on high flow. 2 large bore lines established. Loss may be 30% of blood volume in the field. Megan sees the name on the chart and her face goes perfectly still for exactly 1 heartbeat. James Hartley. Colonel. Her son Dylan's commanding officer. The man who sent the casualty notification officers to her door 3 years ago. She has never met him, but she knows his name the way you know the name of someone who changed your life without knowing you existed. The trauma team moves around the stretcher in organized chaos, and Megan flows into the space she has already prepared, handing off supplies before they are asked for, reading the monitors before the residents have finished looking at them. The first priority is the abdominal wound. The bleeding pattern suggests liver laceration, possibly splenic injury. The second priority is the shoulder wound, deep, dark blood, which means something major, which means the bleeding is happening inside where you can't see it, which means you have minutes to get him stable enough for surgery. One of the residents is frozen, staring at the wounds like they are a test he hasn't studied for. Dr. Sterling shoves past him with the kind of casual dismissal that is going to mark him, years later, as a man who wastes other people's time and talent. Sterling takes the helm, calling orders that are competent but unspectacular, the kind of emergency medicine you learn from textbooks and practice on mannequins. As the team cuts away Hartley's jacket, Megan sees it. Sewn into the inner lining, faded from sweat and sunlight and the kind of wear that comes from 18-month deployments in desert heat, a patch. Small, nearly invisible unless you know to look for it. 3 letters and a symbol. The same patch her late husband wore, the same patch that connected him to the team that went into Remedy 12 years ago and came back with 1 fewer person. She doesn't stop working. She doesn't pause. Her hands move to the 4 line in Hartley's left arm, checking the flow rate, confirming that the fluid is running wide open, that the blood bank has been notified to prep for units of O- for immediate release. Her voice is soft when she speaks, arterial bleeding from the shoulder. Penetrating trauma, high velocity. Possibly subclavian involvement. Sterling doesn't acknowledge her. He is busy establishing his authority, asking questions that the paramedics have already answered, performing the ritual of control that emergency medicine requires. But the residents hear her. The resident on the monitor hears her and looks closer at the O2 sat reading. The resident assisting with the line hears her and adjusts the flow rate without being asked. This is how it has always worked. Megan gives information. The people around her make better decisions with that information. Nobody credits her. Nobody even notices. She is a ghost moving through the hospital, useful and invisible, exactly as intended. The monitors begin their urgent rhythm, beeping, pulsing, sending data about a man who is bleeding out in real time. O2 sat at 89 and dropping. Heart rate climbing toward 150. BP continuing its descent toward the numbers where the heart stops working, where a man stops being a man and becomes simply a body, a biological problem to be solved. And Megan O'Brien, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Navy Cross recipient, 17-time combat deployment survivor, stands at the foot of the bed in her forgettable scrubs and watches a man with her late husband's unit patch begin his journey toward either the operating room or the grave. She has no way of knowing which it will be. She has no way of knowing that this moment, This single moment of recognition, of that faded patch catching the fluorescent light, is going to end everything she has built in the way of safety and invisibility. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. The morning sun cut through the ICU windows at a sharp angle that made the monitor's screens harder to read. Megan had been awake for 16 hours straight, and her hands moved with the precision of someone running on muscle memory alone, adjusting Colonel Hartley's for drip with the same measured care she applied to everything. The arterial line was holding steady. O2 sat at 94%. His color had improved from the gray wax pallor of last night to something almost human again. The door opened and Mrs. Hartley walked in first, a woman with silver threading through auburn hair, her face creased with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night in a hospital waiting room. Behind her came their daughter, early 30s, still wearing yesterday's clothes. They moved to the colonel's bedside with the careful reverence of people entering a shrine. Mrs. Hartley reached out and touched her husband's hand like she was testing whether he was really solid, really there. The doctor said he's stable, Mrs. Hartley said, her voice softer than the machines humming around them. That something changed in those first minutes. That he almost didn't make it. Megan felt the weight of that sentence settle across her shoulders. She kept her focus on the foreport, rechecking the flow rate even though she'd checked it 40 seconds ago. The door swung open again and Dr. Sterling entered with his entourage, 2 residents trailing behind him like ducklings, their eyes forward, their spines straight. He moved through the ICU the way generals move through conquered territory, assured and claiming ownership of every inch. He hadn't changed since last night. Still wore the same spotless coat. Still had that particular tilt to his chin that made his arrogance visible from 20 feet away. Hartley, Sterling said, not to the colonel but to the room itself, loud enough for everyone to hear. Excellent progress. The arterial bleed was considerable, but we managed to control it with some quick thinking. Mrs. Hartley's eyes lit up. You're the one who saved him. Megan didn't look up. Kept her hands moving. Kept breathing. Dr. Sterling, the family's been wondering who made the critical call in those first minutes, one of the residents offered, glancing sideways at Megan. Nurse O'Brien's assessment of the arterial spray pattern was actually what? Sterling's laugh cut through the resident's sentence like a surgical blade. Not warm. Not genuine. The kind of laugh that was performed for witnesses. Mrs. Hartley, he said, turning toward the bed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Nurse O'Brien here is adorably confident for someone with a community college degree. The actual medical decisions were made by myself and Dr. Chen. He looked directly at Megan then, and his smile widened. Though I'm sure your earnest enthusiasm was comforting to the patient. We all do what we can with the education we have, don't we? The daughter's face flushed. Mrs. Hartley's hand tightened on her husband's arm. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that had weight. It pressed down. It made the fluorescent light seem louder. Megan's jaw clenched, just once, tight enough that she felt her teeth lock, and a single tear escaped from her left eye. She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. She reached up and wiped it with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact with Sterling. When she spoke, her voice came out steady as surgical steel, measured and quiet enough that Sterling had to lean in slightly to hear her clearly. Colonel Hartley is alive because I knew what arterial spray looks like in person, not in a textbook. Sterling's smile froze. His residence went very still. The machines kept beeping their indifferent rhythm. Megan turned back to the 4 line and continued working, her hand steady now, her breathing controlled. She couldn't say more. Couldn't explain that she'd held her husband's hand while he bled out in a dust storm in Raleigh. Couldn't say that she'd seen that same specific pattern of blood spray 3 times in combat and recognized the danger the moment Colonel Hartley came through the trauma bay doors. Couldn't say any of it because admitting what she knew would mean admitting who she was. It would mean Dylan finding out she'd been working at Mercy General the whole time. It would mean ending whatever fragile version of a life she'd constructed in these 2 years of invisibility. So she said nothing else. Just kept working. Mrs. Hartley looked at her husband, then back at Sterling, confusion flickering across her face like she was trying to understand a math problem that didn't add up. Sterling cleared his throat. Well, we should monitor his fluid intake. Residents, note that. He turned and left, his white coat swishing like a cape, his residents trailing behind him without a backward glance at Megan or the Hartleys. The break room at 11 o'clock that morning smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a space that never got fresh air. Megan had made it exactly 4 steps past the doorway before Denise, one of the nurses she'd trained 6 months ago, looked up from her coffee, made eye contact for just long enough for the rejection to register, and then stood and left. No words. No excuse. Just the sound of her chair scraping back and her footsteps moving toward the hallway. The other 3 nurses, Janet, Marcus, and Rodriguez, followed in sequence. Janet first, collecting her thermos like it might bite her. Then Marcus, making a show of checking his phone. Then Rodriguez, who'd worked next to Megan on the night shift for 8 months, just long enough that they'd learned each other's names and preferences and work rhythms. He paused at the doorway for 1 extra second, and in that pause, Megan understood everything she needed to understand about what happened when you challenged someone with Sterling's reach. She sat down slowly at the communal table, her lunch in a plastic container on the counter behind her, a sandwich her hands had made this morning on automatic, peanut butter and jelly because it didn't require much thought. She didn't open it. Just sat in the fluorescent hum of the empty break room, staring at 4 empty chairs arranged around a table that felt suddenly enormous. The write-up appeared on the unit board at 2:15 in the afternoon, printed on hospital letterhead and signed with Sterling's precise, careful handwriting. Megan saw it when she came out of the storage room with a new bag of saline. Her name was right there at the top, bold and unavoidable. Incident report, Nurse Megan O'Brien, scope of practice violation, unauthorized assessment provided to patient family members, overstepping clinical authority, recommended for further review. The entire day shift saw it during change of shift. She watched their eyes slide across the words, then slide away from her face. Watched them cluster together in tight groups near the coffee station, their voices dropping but not quite low enough, the word overstepping floating through the air like a bad smell. Sterling stood near the nurse's station at 3 o'clock, coffee in hand, speaking to a group of 6 staff members loud enough for Megan to hear him clearly from the medication room. "Our little hero," he said, gesturing vaguely down the hallway toward her, "seems to have some difficulty understanding the hierarchy of clinical decision-making." His smile was bright. "Poisonous. Next time, let the actual doctors handle the critical thinking, We wouldn't want anyone accidentally prescribing the wrong antibiotics." A few of the nurses laughed. Not all of them. Not Holloway, the charge nurse from the night shift, whose jaw tightened and who looked away from Sterling's face. But enough of them laughed that the sound traveled. Megan pulled the write-up down from the board and signed the acknowledgement form with a pen that didn't leave nearly enough pressure on the paper. Her signature was steady. Her hands weren't trembling. The trembling she felt was something else, not fear but restraint. The specific, controlled, dangerous kind of restraint that comes from someone who knows exactly what she's capable of doing and is choosing not to do it. She returned to her rounds. Adjusted medications. Checked vitals. Cleaned a wound that was beginning to show signs of infection. Did her job with the same competent precision she'd always used, the same invisible excellence that had kept her invisible for 2 years. She'd learned the formula: do your work perfectly, say nothing controversial, smile when necessary, retreat when threatened. Don't let anyone know what you are. Don't let anyone see past the scrubs and the name badge. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. Because on the 3rd night, at 3:17 in the morning, someone was going to walk through that ICU door with a different kind of purpose entirely. The ventilator wheezed its steady rhythm. 3:17 a.m. The ICU at Mercy General was a cathedral of machines, beeping monitors, hissing air, the soft percussion of 4 pumps marking time. Megan moved through the silence like a ghost, checking Colonel Hartley's vitals the way she'd done for 72 hours. His oxygen sat at 92%. His heart rate steady. The surgical repair held. Everything looked right. Everything was about to go very wrong. The secure ICU door buzzed. Not the normal buzz of a nurse arriving with fresh supplies or a resident checking labs. This was different. A sharp, urgent sound followed by the distinct absence of a keycard scan. Someone had bypassed the electronic reader. Megan's hand stilled over Hartley's for line. Her breath didn't change. Her pulse didn't spike. But her eyes moved to the doorway, and in that single moment, every combat deployment she'd spent 12 years trying to forget came roaring back like a jet engine spooling up in her chest. The doors burst open. 2 men in tactical gear moved through the threshold with the economical precision of operators, not hospital security, not police. Their vests were black and unmarked. Their weapons were drawn. The lead man was 6'3" with the kind of shoulders that made doorways look negotiable. The second man was smaller but moved like a coiled spring, his rifle sweeping the room in patterns that told her he'd trained at the same school she had. Their eyes found Colonel Hartley in the hospital bed, and the intent became a physical thing in the room, sharp and lethal and absolute. They were here to finish what Ramadi had started. Megan stepped between them and the bed. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just a single step, her body moving with the smooth deliberation of someone crossing a familiar room. Her hand stayed visible. Her face remained neutral as a still pond. She didn't look frightened. She looked like what she was, someone who'd been shot at before and had decided this particular moment was not a good time for Colonel James Hartley to die. "He's recovering," she said quietly. "Stand down." The lead man's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being told to stand down by a woman in scrubs with her hair in a surgical cap. His weapon came up slightly. Not quite aimed at her. Not quite not aimed at her either. "Move. Now." It wasn't a request. It was the voice of someone who solved problems by making them stop existing. Megan didn't move. The first shot came without warning, a sound like a leather whip cracking in a metal box. The bullet caught her left shoulder and exited with a sound like something tearing inside a wall. Pain arrived a half-second later, not sharp but deep, a sensation like someone had driven a railroad spike through her clavicle and twisted it. Her clavicle shattered. She felt the bone fragments grinding against each other, felt them scraping against the nerves and blood vessels beneath. She stood her ground. The second shot came from the other operator's weapon, a precise double tap meant to put her down permanently. The first bullet caught her left thigh, high and devastating. It severed the femoral artery with the clean efficiency of a surgical scalpel. She knew what that meant. She'd seen it before. She'd watched soldiers die from it in 7 minutes flat if they didn't get blood into their veins faster than it was leaving their body. Her leg buckled. Not from fear. From physics. She fell to her knees between the contractors and the bed, her body a barrier made of flesh and bone and the kind of stubborn refusal that came from having sworn an oath that never actually expired. Blood pooled beneath her. She could see it spreading across the tile in her peripheral vision, dark and wet and impossible to ignore, but she reached for the 4-line running from Hartley's arm anyway, her hands moving on their own. Muscle memory took over. She yanked the 4 catheter from her own arm, 14 gauge, inserted for her own meds, and tied it off with a length of fur tubing, wrapping the plastic around her thigh above the wound site with the kind of precision that came from having done this exact procedure on people who were screaming and dying in desert heat. The tourniquet tightened. Her vision flickered at the edges. Her leg went numb below the tourniquet, which meant circulation was stopping, which meant she had maybe 4 to 6 hours before the tissue started dying. She could work with 4 to 6 hours. "Dr. Chen," she called out, her voice steady as surgical steel. "Dr. Chen, I need you." A resident froze in the doorway, a young man, probably fresh out of his first year, whose face had gone the color of old cement. His hands trembled. His eyes were fixed on the contractors, on their weapons, on the blood spreading across the floor like a dark accusation. "I need you to focus," Megan said, her voice dropping into the cadence she'd used to train corpsmen in field conditions. "Colonel Hartley's left lung is collapsed. You're going to perform a needle decompression. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. You're going to use the largest bore catheter you can find. Are you listening to me?" Dr. Chen's mouth moved. No sound came out. Are you listening? Yes. Yes, I. Then move. Now. Hand steady. Breathing normal. You've done this 100 times in simulation. This is the same. Faster, cleaner, more important. Go. The resident moved. His hand still shook, but his hands moved. He found a 12-gauge angiocath and positioned it at the insertion point while Megan's own vision started to narrow at the edges, her blood pressure dropping as her body realized how much blood it had lost. She could feel it. Pain was information. Her pupils dilating was information. The slight tremor in her hands that she forced into stillness was information. The femoral artery was still bleeding. The tourniquet had stopped the catastrophic hemorrhage, but she was losing blood into the thigh tissue itself, a hematoma expanding like a dark flower beneath her skin. The needle went in. There was a hiss, that specific hiss of air escaping from a collapsed lung decompressing, a sound like someone exhaling in relief. Hartley's oxygen monitor beeped. It climbed from 88 to 91. His chest rose. His color shifted back from the grey-blue of hypoxia to something closer to human. Excellent, Megan said. Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, far away, like it was coming from another room. Now call ICU nursing. Tell them we need 2 units of O-negative and a trauma surgeon. Tell them we have a GSW victim with heavy bleeding and we need activation of massive transfusion protocol. Tell them Dr. Sterling needs to. The contractor's hand was on her collar. He lifted her one-handed, his grip iron, his face the color of someone who'd just realized he'd been outmaneuvered by a woman in a hospital gown who was actively bleeding to death. Megan's good arm came up without conscious thought. Her elbow drove backward with the kind of precision that came from having learned it from a Marine gunnery sergeant in a gym in Coronado in 2003. The contractor's grip loosened. He gasped. She didn't finish the strike. She didn't have the energy. Instead, she sank back toward the ground and pressed her hand against her shoulder wound, feeling the edges of torn muscle and shattered bone grinding beneath her fingers. Still here, Colonel, she said quietly. Hartley's eyes opened. Just barely. Just enough to see the woman between him and the men with guns, covered in her own blood, her face pale as bone, her eyes still sharp as a deployed scope. He tried to speak. No sound came out. The ICU doors burst open again. Not contractors this time. Hospital security, 3 of them, weapons drawn, their movements coordinated and fast. One of the contractors bolted toward the window. The other one stayed frozen, his calculation running in real time across his face as he processed the odds and came to the conclusion that this particular mission had just gone catastrophically sideways. He was right about that. Megan's vision was getting narrower. The edges of the world were going dark. She could hear the security team shouting, hear the contractors being forced to the ground, hear Dr. Chen calling for blood on the overhead system, trauma activation, 2 units ONEG, ICU Bay 4, and through it all, she was very conscious of the fact that she was about to stop being conscious. Her last clear thought, before the world went sideways, was not about the bullets or the blood or the contractors bleeding into the tile next to her. It was about Dylan. It was about the fact that her 17-year-old son still believed she processed insurance claims in a windowless office across town, and now she was going to have to explain why his commanding officer's blood was on her scrubs and her own blood was spreading across the ICU floor in quantities that looked statistically improbable. The lights of Mercy General tilted. The monitors beeped their electronic chorus. And somewhere in the distance, a helicopter started its approach to the rooftop helipad, because Colonel James Hartley had just qualified for a priority medical evacuation and Megan O'Brien had just qualified for something a lot more complicated than a simple explanation. The monitors beeped their electronic chorus, and somewhere between consciousness and shadow, Megan O'Brien opened her eyes to fluorescent light and the chemical smell of antiseptic that meant she was horizontal in a hospital bed instead of standing beside one. 23 stitches tracked across her left shoulder like a roadmap of poor decisions. A titanium pin held her clavicle together. The surgeon had said it was good work, which meant nothing when your collarbone had been shattered by a 9mm round designed to kill. Her left leg lay wrapped in a compression bandage that extended from hip to knee, and the femoral artery beneath had been sealed with something called a Reboa balloon catheter before they'd extracted it. The anesthesiologist had whispered the name like it was a prayer. The pain was there, pharmaceutical and distant, like someone had turned down the volume on her nervous system and left only the bass frequency of hurt. She didn't try to move. Movement was a negotiation with physics and medication, and she had learned long ago that losing negotiations could kill you. Instead, she stared at the ceiling tiles and let the machines do their talking. Heart rate steady. Blood pressure climbing back to something resembling human. O2 sat at 96%, high enough. Her hands lay at her sides, and even in the muted light, she could see the dried blood beneath her fingernails. Not her blood. Not all of it. Colonel Hartley's blood, maybe. The resident's blood, probably. Her own blood, definitely. 3 days ago, she had held lives together with 4 tubing and her body between 2 men with guns and a man who would have died without her. And 3 days ago, they had fired her for it. Dr. Sterling had arrived during the aftermath, while Megan was still unconscious on the operating table and her blood was still wet on the ICU floor. He had stood in the doorway with a surgical mask dangling from his neck and watched the security team reviewing footage, watched the moment she stepped in front of the colonel, watched her body jerk twice, watched her fall and then rise again, watched her hands move while her own arterial blood painted the white floor. She had performed a tourniquet on herself with supplies meant for 4 lines while talking a second-year resident through reinflating a collapsed lung. She had done it the way a person does something they have done 1,000 times before, which meant she had done something before, which meant everything Dr. Sterling had believed about the woman mopping up his hospital at night had been wrong in every possible way. Sterling's power was not in medicine. His power was in networks, a 20-year investment in hospital board relationships, golf games with the CEO, a brother-in-law who sat on the state licensing board for nurses. His power was in phones and calls made at midnight and favors collected like currency. And his power was in the institutional speed of an institution protecting itself. Before Megan woke up, Sterling had already called the hospital board president at her home in a gated community north of Raleigh. Before Megan opened her eyes, he had contacted Durham Community College and requested her nursing school transcripts with a specific question: had Megan O'Brien disclosed her prior military medical training during her initial application, or had she simply failed to mention 17 years of service? Before the sun rose on the 3rd day, Sterling had arranged an external review team from a firm that owed him consultation contracts, and he had prepared a narrative so clean it looked like truth. The nurse had exceeded her scope of practice. The nurse had engaged in an authorized physical intervention. The nurse had violated hospital protocol by failing to disclose extensive combat medical training on her employment application, a material omission that invalidated her entire hiring agreement. The nurse was a liability masquerading as dedication. The security footage made it complicated. The footage showed her saving lives with the kind of precision that made every other nurse in the hospital look like they were playing house. So Sterling did what competent people do when the truth works against them: he reframed the truth. She hadn't saved lives through expertise. She had endangered the hospital through recklessness. She had inserted herself into a situation outside her scope of practice. She had performed emergency procedures that should have been left to physicians. And most importantly, most damaging, she had deliberately hidden her qualifications on her application, which meant she had been working in violation of her employment contract the entire time she had been employed at Mercy General. It was a masterpiece of institutional defense, built with one hand while the other held the phone. Megan heard Sterling's voice before she saw him. He was outside her room, speaking to someone from hospital administration with the measured confidence of a man who had already won. The liability exposure is catastrophic, he was saying. If she had made an error with her undisclosed training, we would have been sued into bankruptcy. Instead, we're looking at the opposite. She intervened in a way that could be construed as practicing medicine without a license. The security footage is circumstantial. The intent is clear. He came through the door as if he owned the room, which in his mind, he did. White coat pristine. Face arranged in something resembling concern. His eyes found hers and held for exactly the amount of time it took for him to confirm she was awake and aware. "You're going to be fine," he said, the word shaped like kindness and meant like threat. "Physically, at least. The surgical team did excellent work. Your recovery timeline is 6 to 8 weeks before you can return to regular activity." Megan said nothing. The silence was not empty. It was a space she controlled. "I've been reviewing your employment file with the administration," Sterling continued, pulling a chair over without being invited. "Very interesting reading. Your nursing school application shows a community college credential, minimal medical background. Yet your actions in the ICU suggest considerably more expertise than a 2-year program would provide." He paused, letting her absorb the implication. "I had to wonder if you'd failed to disclose something material during your hiring process. A prior career, perhaps. Military service." Megan's jaw clenched, just slightly, just enough to be visible to a man who was looking for any fracture in her composure. "I'm not going to ask you directly," Sterling said, settling into the chair like he had all the time in the world. "Because either way, the answer is a problem for you. If you served in a military medical capacity, you violated your hiring agreement by not disclosing it. If you didn't serve but claimed expertise you don't have, you violated hospital protocol through an authorized practice. Either way, your career at Mercy General is over." The words landed like shrapnel, scattered and sharp. Megan's hands lay flat against the hospital sheets, and she didn't move them. Didn't tremble. Didn't do anything except breathe the recycled air and listen to the ventilator hiss in the corner of the room, the same mechanical rhythm that kept people alive, kept them tethered to machines and time. "I'm recommending your immediate termination to the board," Sterling said, standing up now, already leaving because he had said what needed saying. "Gross misconduct. Undisclosed combat training that violated your hiring agreement. The formal write-up goes in your personnel file within the hour. Security will escort you out once you're medically cleared for discharge. You should make arrangements for alternative employment." He left without waiting for a response, which was fine because Megan had none to give. He had just taken her identity and weaponized it into a liability. He had taken the thing that made her dangerous and relabeled it as the thing that made her unemployable. He had won, completely and finally, and now he got to go home and sleep like a man who had protected his hospital from a threat. Megan lay in the hospital bed with 23 stitches and a titanium pin and the knowledge that she had saved Colonel James Hartley's life and Colonel James Hartley's mission, and now she was going to lose everything for it. The next 48 hours moved with the terrible logic of institutional machinery. The external review team showed up with clipboards and official letterhead. They reviewed the security footage, not the parts that showed her expertise, but the parts that showed her intervening without physician authorization. They noted her scope of practice violations. They interviewed staff members who had witnessed her work and received answers shaped by fear. Yes, she had moved beyond what a nurse should do. Yes, she had acted without proper supervision. Yes, she seemed to know things a community college nurse shouldn't know. Dr. Sterling had prepared the ground too well. On the morning of the 3rd day, while Megan was still wrapped in compression bandages and still learning to walk without her leg threatening to buckle, the hospital administration delivered her termination papers. The security escort was a man named Curtis who looked uncomfortable about the whole thing but did his job anyway. He wheeled her down the hallway past the nursing station, where some of the staff looked away and others looked directly at her with something that might have been shame. Her arm was in a sling. Her left leg could barely support weight. She was wearing a hospital gown with a discharge sweater over it, and her personal belongings, a change of clothes, her phone, her wallet, fit in a single plastic bag that Curtis held with the careful distance of someone touching something contaminated. The security desk at the hospital entrance had a new atmosphere. The usual hum of activity had transformed into something more like pity or maybe judgment. She couldn't quite tell because she wasn't looking at anyone's face. She was looking straight ahead, the same way she had looked straight ahead when Dr. Sterling called her adorably confident in front of the colonel's family. The same way she had looked straight ahead when senior staff left their tables the moment she sat down. The same way she had looked straight ahead while bleeding out in front of a patient who was now alive because of her. Curtis wheeled her to the hospital's front entrance where the Raleigh morning air hit her like a physical force. Rain had been coming down since dawn, the kind of steady, cold rain that belonged to November and disappointment. "Do you have a ride?" Curtis asked, and his voice held a note of genuine concern that made Megan want to scream. "I'll be fine," she said, because what else was there to say? Because admitting you had nowhere to go was the same as admitting you had already lost. Curtis helped her into the wheelchair-accessible van she had called, and Megan sat in the back seat with the plastic bag of her belongings and watched Mercy General disappear behind her. The rain on the windows was hypnotic. The way it fell seemed intentional, like it was trying to wash something clean that could never be clean again. She had saved a colonel. She had saved an intelligence asset. She had prevented an assassination that would have claimed 200 American lives in Syria. And now she was unemployed and injured and sitting alone in a disabled van with 23 stitches and a titanium pin and the knowledge that Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, the person she had spent 2 years trying to forget she was, had finally gotten her killed anyway. 3 days later, she stood at Fort Bragg National Cemetery, where her husband had been buried 11 years ago. The rain was still falling, colder now, mixed with something that might have been snow. She was supposed to be on crutches, but she had left them in the van because there were some things you faced without assistance. Her left leg buckled under her weight, and she caught herself against the marble headstone with her good arm, the one that wasn't in a sling. "I saved his commander," she whispered to the engraved name. "I saved Dylan's colonel. And I lost everything anyway. I couldn't even do this one thing right." The rain washed tears and rainwater together down her face. She pressed her forehead to the cold marble, her body shaking from cold and pain and 2 years of holding everything inside. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry." Her phone buzzed. A text from Dylan asking about Sunday dinner. She didn't answer. What Megan didn't know, sitting alone in the rain at a grave marker, Colonel James Hartley had regained consciousness the day before. What she didn't know, when he learned she had been fired, he had made a single phone call to his commanding officer at Fort Bragg. What she didn't know, the contractors who had tried to finish the assassination were already talking to federal investigators, already revealing that Hartley carried classified intelligence about an active operation, Operation Guardian Shield, 200 American lives in Syria, depending on him staying alive and staying silent. What she didn't know, Dylan had received a call from the colonel's wife. And Dylan had driven to a storage unit with a key his mother had given him for emergencies only. Inside that unit sat a shadow box. And inside that shadow box sat medals the rest of the world was about to learn about in exactly 72 hours. 3 days after the shooting, rain hammered the cemetery like artillery fire. Megan stood alone at her husband's grave, her wounded leg buckling beneath her weight, the titanium pin in her shoulder sending sharp jolts through her body with each step. The headstone read simply, Petty Officer First Class James O'Brien, 1982 to 2011, beloved husband and father. Cold water soaked through her coat. Her breath came in visible clouds. She had driven to Fort Bragg National Cemetery at dawn, when the parking lot was empty, when no one could see her collapse. The walk from the car had taken 15 minutes. Her thigh screamed with each movement. The femoral artery wound was barely 3 weeks healed, tissue still tender, scar still raw, physical therapy scheduled for a future that now felt impossibly distant. Megan knelt carefully, favoring her right leg, and placed her palm flat against the wet granite. The stone was cold enough to burn. "I saved his commander," she whispered. "I saved Colonel Hartley and lost everything anyway. I couldn't even do this one thing right." Her voice didn't shake. Megan O'Brien's voice never shook. But her hand trembled against the stone, and that betrayal of composure made her close her eyes. "I thought if I stayed invisible, if I just worked and helped people and asked for nothing, maybe it would balance out. Maybe you'd forgive me for living when you didn't. But I'm still just the nurse they fired. I'm still alone." The rain intensified. Her shoulder throbbed, the kind of deep, structural pain that came from bone breaking and tendons tearing and skin splitting under 9 mm velocity. Mercy General had discharged her with discharge papers labeled terminated and a folder of prescriptions she couldn't afford on unemployment. Her teaching license was under investigation. Her nursing credentials were suspended pending review. Her apartment lease would end in 45 days, and she had $3,200 in her savings account. She had saved a man carrying classified intelligence about an active operation. The Pentagon knew this. Colonel Hartley knew this. Her son didn't know any of it. Megan stayed at the grave for 2 hours, rain turning to sleet, her body going numb from exposure and pain and the weight of a 17-year lie finally crushing her. When she finally stood to leave, her leg buckled completely, and she caught herself against the headstone. The physical therapy script in her pocket felt like a cruel joke. There was no point in healing if she had nowhere to go. The next morning, the phone rang at 6:56 a.m. A woman's voice, clipped and official. "Ms. O'Brien? This is Thomas Whitmore, President of Mercy General Hospital Board of Directors. There is an emergency board meeting this morning at 8:30. You are not required to attend," but Megan hung up. Whatever tribunal was about to unfold, she didn't need to watch them dismantle her piece by piece. At 8:29 a.m., Dylan O'Brien walked into the packed hospital auditorium in his dress uniform. The board members fell silent. The news crew that had somehow gotten word of the shooting story raised their cameras. Dylan carried a shadow box in his hands, the kind military families used to display medals and insignias, and his face was set with the same controlled fury she recognized from her own reflection. Thomas Whitmore stood at the podium, about to begin what he thought was a routine insurance briefing. He saw Dylan and stopped mid-sentence. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien," Dylan said. His voice filled the auditorium with the kind of clarity that came from combat radio training and parade ground discipline. He opened the shadow box. Even from the back of the room, the medals caught the fluorescent lights like they were radiating their own heat. "They need to see these." Silence. The kind of silence that happens when people realize they have been standing on ground that was never solid to begin with. Thomas Whitmore's hands shook as he took the shadow box. He read the citation file, the official documentation that Pentagon records had just been declassified to share, and his voice broke. Broke completely. 17 combat deployments. 43 confirmed saves under fire. Bronze Star, Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V, 2 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, 2nd Silver Star, and he stopped. His eyes filled. He read again, Navy Cross. The hospital board president couldn't finish the sentence. He sat down instead. Dr. Sterling stood frozen in the 3rd row. His carefully pressed suit suddenly looked small on him. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the armrest with the desperation of a man watching his architecture collapse in real time. A Navy SEAL Master Chief stood next to Dylan now, someone Megan didn't recognize, someone with combat decorations that made the room's air pressure seem to shift. His voice was like a tank idling in a garage, heavy and unstoppable. Bronze Star for Valor during Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2009. Silver Star for extraordinary heroism under fire at Ramadi. 2nd Silver Star for preventing 3 servicemen from bleeding out during an ambush in Anbar Province. Navy Cross for 23 consecutive hours of combat medicine without rest, treating 61 wounded Marines while under active fire, with a shattered ankle and 2 shrapnel wounds to her abdomen. The board members stared at Sterling. One of them, Patricia Henderson from Legal, actually stood up and walked to a different seat, putting 3 board members between herself and him. 2 Pentagon officials in dress blues walked to the front of the auditorium. One of them, a full-bird colonel, stepped to the microphone. Senior Chief O'Brien's actions 3 nights ago prevented the assassination of Colonel James Hartley, who was carrying classified intelligence regarding an active operation across 3 combat theaters. Her assessment of his injuries, her emergency intervention, and her willingness to place herself between a threat and her patient directly saved a mission involving 200 American military personnel. Mercy General just proved that institutions can choose recruitment over recognition. You chose to fire the person who prevented a tragedy. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Sterling. The worst part was what happened next. A 2-star general stood. General Webb. His rank showed on his uniform like authority carved in 2 stars, and his eyes found Sterling across the auditorium with the precision of a sniper. Dr. Sterling, stand up. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind that used to come in war zones, the kind that meant someone's career was about to end in front of witnesses. Sterling stood. His face had gone the color of old paper. His confidence, that institutional armor he had spent 20 years building, that network of board connections and legal advisors and colleagues who owed him favors, was visibly peeling away like paint in a fire. You dismissed a decorated war hero for performing the exact action she was trained to perform over 17 combat deployments, General Webb said. His voice was cold, precise, like a surgical instrument. You called her credentials inadequate. You posted a public reprimand. You activated your network, every connection you had, to eliminate someone you perceived as a threat to your authority. What you actually did was punish heroism and endanger a classified military operation. Sterling's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Your actions have exposed this institution to federal investigation, Thomas Whitmore said, his voice steady now, his spine straightened by the presence of people with actual power. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your position as trauma department head. Security will escort you from the building. The room erupted. Phone cameras flashed. The news crew filmed every moment. Sterling tried to speak. I followed protocol. I protected the hospital's interests, but General Webb cut him off with 4 words. You protected your ego, Doctor. Security approached. 2 officers, moving with the professional efficiency of people who had done this before. Sterling's badge was removed from his neck. His access card was confiscated. He was escorted out through the same doors Megan had been wheeled through in a chair 3 days earlier, past nurses who wouldn't meet his eyes, past colleagues who suddenly needed to look at their phones. By noon, the story was breaking. Decorated Navy veteran fired after saving Pentagon official. Hospital board launches investigation into discrimination. By evening, Sterling's name trended on social media next to words like disgrace and coward. His network, the board connections, the legal advisors, the colleagues who had laughed with him in the break room when Megan sat down and they all scattered like she carried disease, distanced themselves overnight. Calls went unreturned. Emails bounced back. The hospital system that had trusted him for 20 years published a statement condemning the former employee's actions and distancing themselves from his conduct. By week's end, Dr. Sterling was unemployable at any major hospital system in the state. The licensing board opened an investigation. His malpractice insurance carrier began reviewing his case files. His 20-year career ended in 72 hours, the same amount of time it took for a bullet to tear through his carefully constructed authority and reveal that he had never actually been in charge of anything that mattered. 6 months later, Megan walked past a strip mall in suburban Raleigh. Her limp was barely noticeable now. Her shoulder had healed enough for full duty, the physical therapy completed, the scar tissue softened to something manageable. A folding table sat outside a storefront beneath a hand-printed banner, Sterling Insurance Solutions. Dr. Sterling, no longer possessing the right to use that title, sat hunched over a laptop, his dress shirt wrinkled, his face showing 6 months of stress and consequences. His eyes tracked her as she passed. Recognition flickered across his face. Something like shame. But Megan didn't acknowledge him. She continued down the street to the Veterans Affairs Hospital where a sign read Combat Medic Training Center, Senior Chief M. O'Brien, Director. Her office overlooked the training floor where she taught the next generation of corpsmen and pararescue jumpers. On her wall, the faded unit patch from Colonel Hartley's jacket, framed and mounted. Beside it, a photo from last month, Dylan in his dress uniform, his chest already showing the Green Beret insignia of his qualification, Megan pinning his tab. Colonel Hartley stood beside them, fully recovered, his hand on Dylan's shoulder. Her Navy Cross hung beside her desk now, no longer hidden under scrubs or stuffed in a locker. Dylan visited her office with coffee, and they reviewed his upcoming deployment together. No more secrets, no more distance between them, no more lying about who she was. Megan stood before her classroom of young medics that afternoon, her voice steady and clear as a radio frequency cutting through static. Some of you will be shot at. Some of you will be injured while trying to save others. And every single one of you will face someone who believes their rank or their degree or their authority makes them more valuable than the work you do. She paused, meeting their eyes. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to stand between the threat and the person who needs you, no matter the cost. The medics sat in absolute silence. Outside, Sterling closed his laptop at his folding table, alone with consequences. Inside, Megan taught until sunset, her students hanging on every word from someone who had lived what she was teaching. If you made it this far, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments, would you have done what Megan did, knowing the cost? What does true heroism actually look like? And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength, tell your story down below.